By 1992, studios were still chasing the same late 80s mindset. Spend big, attach recognizable names, and the box office will basically handle the rest. Hollywood kept doubling down on ambitious animation, high-concept comedies, and prestige biopics. Projects that looked like automatic wins. The kind of thing that gets greenlit because it looks great in a boardroom. But here's the part people forget. A movie doesn't have to be bad to be a flop, just expensive and ignored. Once you factor in marketing and distribution, a film can make its budget back and still lose a scary amount of money. So today, we're counting down 1992's biggest box office flops. What they cost, what the studios thought they had, and the decision that turned "this should work" into "why did they greenlight this?" Including the year Hollywood released two Columbus epics at once, a sci-fi disaster so messy the director used a pseudonym, and a Stallone comedy even Stallone regretted. 1992 marked the 500th anniversary of Columbus's voyage, and Hollywood did what Hollywood does. It tried to turn a historical milestone into a box office moment. The logic probably felt bulletproof. Big anniversary, built-in awareness, classrooms already talking about it. So instead of one carefully positioned prestige epic, the industry released two major Columbus films at basically the same time, which is how you end up with overexposure before audiences even buy a ticket. First up, Christopher Columbus, The Discovery. This is the classic version of the story. The determined explorer fighting for funding from the Spanish crown, finally getting the ships and sailing west into legend. It's pitched like a grand adventure, the kind of thing that should have played as a big-screen historical crowd pleaser. The problem is that it never really lands as either inspiring or entertaining. Instead, the movie got hit from multiple angles. Critics and audiences complained about wooden acting, and even people who weren't historians could feel the historical inaccuracies piling up. And in a movie like this, that matters. Because if the characters don't feel alive, and the history doesn't feel convincing, all you're left with is expensive pageantry. The film flatlined quickly once it hit theaters. It didn't build momentum. It didn't become a word-of-mouth discovery. And it definitely didn't become the anniversary event Warner Brothers wanted. Financially, the damage was immediate and ugly. A $45 million budget and a loss of roughly $37 million. And just to really twist the knife, the movie's reputation got capped off with that very public punchline. Tom Selleck winning the Razzie for Worst Supporting Actor. That's one of those headlines that signals to everyone else, yeah, this one didn't work, even if they haven't seen a single frame. And here's where it gets even wilder. At the exact same time, Paramount released their own Columbus film, 1492, Conquest of Paradise. On paper, this one should have been the safe prestige play. You've got Ridley Scott directing, a serious tone, lush visuals, and a $47 million budget backing it up. And it's aiming for something different than the Warner film. Less swashbuckling adventure, more sweeping, somber historical epic. The story tracks Columbus from the struggle to fund the voyage, through the New World, into governance, and finally into the fall from grace, which, in theory, gives it more weight and more drama than a simple man discovers American narrative. But here's the catch. Even if this one is the more artistic film, it still had the same basic selling point. It's still a Columbus movie. And audiences in 1992 weren't looking at the poster and thinking, which Columbus do I want to see? They were thinking, do I want to spend my weekend on Columbus at all? That's what really sank both ships. Columbus fatigue. Two studios took an anniversary and turned it into homework. And by releasing these films into the same cultural window, they basically competed to cancel each other out. 1492 didn't become the prestige breakout Paramount hoped for. It stalled. It couldn't find a broad audience, and it couldn't generate the kind of enthusiasm a budget like that needs to survive. And when a movie like this underperforms, the losses get brutal fast. The budget burn here was even worse, with a loss of roughly $40 million. While the Columbus movies were sinking, Robin Williams was taking a totally different kind of gamble with toys. This was a long-time passion project for Williams and director Barry Levinson, and 20th Century Fox spent $43 million to bring its weird, specific vision to life. On paper, the premise is simple. Williams plays an eccentric son of a toy manufacturer who has to protect his father's whimsical factory from a militaristic uncle, an outsider who wants to turn children's toys into remote-controlled weapons of war. That sounds like a clean, high-concept satire, especially with Robin Williams in the lead. But Toys is famous less for its story and more for its look. The production design is wildly avant-garde, like a living surrealist painting. Bold, imaginative, and intentionally artificial. And that's also what made it such a tough sell. Critics called the plot aimless, and families who expected an easy Robin Williams crowd pleaser found the tone confusing and inaccessible. The financial damage was real. The film lost roughly $22 million. The takeaway is brutal but clear. Sometimes even the biggest star in the world can't sell a movie that's too artistic for its own good. If toys is what happens when a studio bankrolls pure creative ambition, the next flop is what happens when they spend big expecting a sure thing, and the audience just shrugs. Because on paper, Hero had all the ingredients for a prestige hit. Columbia Pictures put $42 million behind it, betting on an A-list trio: Dustin Hoffman, Gina Davis, and Andy Garcia. And a premise that sounds like awards season catnip. The setup really is great. A cynical, small-time criminal rescues passengers from a crashed airplane, then disappears before anyone can identify him. When a charismatic, homeless veteran steps in and takes the credit, it turns into a full-on media circus, digging into hero worship, image-making, and how fast the public latches onto a story that feels good, whether it's true or not. But that kind of satire is a tricky sell to a mainstream weekend crowd. The tone lands in an awkward middle zone, too dark to play like a crowd-pleasing drama, and too slippery to feel like a clean comedy. So instead of prestige with bite, a lot of audiences just read it as kinda confusing. Financially, it stung. Hero lost roughly $20 million, and the lesson is pretty simple. Cynicism is a tough pitch when people show up to the holidays looking for comfort food. Next, we jump into animation, where Don Bluth was trying to survive the peak of the Disney Renaissance with Rock-a-Doodle. On paper, it's a weird but sellable premise. A farm rooster who genuinely believes his crowing makes the sun rise gets humiliated, storms off, and heads to the big city to reinvent himself as an Elvis-style rock star. Meanwhile, a young boy gets transformed into a kitten and literally travels into the animated world to track the rooster down, bring him back, and save the farm from a never-ending storm. It's part fairy tale, part music fantasy, part kids' adventure. Which is also the problem, because in practice, the movie feels like it can't decide what it wants to be. Critics called out the live-action animation blend as jarring, and the plot's logic is so all over the place that it's hard for the audience, especially families, to settle into it. And when a kid's movie's confusing, word of mouth dies fast. Rock-a-Doodle didn't explode, it just disappeared. Financially, it still hurt. On an $18 million budget, the film lost about $7 million. And the bigger takeaway is what it represented. This was one more sign that the window was closing for independent animation studios trying to go toe-to-toe with a full-powered Disney machine. Now for one of those cases where you can do almost everything right and still lose the audience. Chaplin gave Robert Downey Jr. an Oscar-worthy showcase, but even that couldn't keep it afloat. TriStar Pictures spent $31 million to tell the life story of the silent film icon, with Downey Jr. front and center. Structurally, it's a classic cradle-to-grave biopic. We start with Chaplin's impoverished childhood in London, follow his rise into Hollywood superstardom, and end with the controversy and eventual exile. Along the way, the film tries to braid together his messy personal life with the creation of his most famous screen moments, basically selling the idea that you're watching the full story of a legend. And to be fair, Downey Jr. delivered the goods. He even earned a Best Actor nomination, but the movie itself didn't become an event. In a crowded holiday season, it didn't break through. It didn't build word of mouth, and it just quietly slipped under the water. Financially, the hit was real. Chaplin lost roughly $19 million. And the bigger takeaway is that this was another sign the standard historical checklist biopic formula was starting to wear thin. Because audiences wanted more than just a greatest hits timeline, even when the lead performance was excellent. Seventh on the list, and it's Solar Crisis, a sci-fi flop so messy that its delayed US release in 1992 didn't just hurt it, it basically exposed it. Even though the movie had been produced earlier, by the time it finally showed up stateside, it already felt out of step. And that delay only made the whole thing look worse. The premise is pure high-concept disaster sci-fi. A crew of astronauts is sent on an emergency mission to the sun to drop a bomb into a massive solar flare before it grows so large it incinerates Earth. It's the kind of idea that sounds like it could be a big screen spectacle until the movie has to actually execute it. On the way, the crew deals with mechanical failures, mounting paranoia, and a saboteur who genuinely believes the apocalypse is a good thing and tries to derail the mission from the inside. So you've got Save the Planet Planet stakes, plus a thriller element. Again, great on paper, but the end result was a total dead end. The production became so notorious that the director used a pseudonym to distance himself from the finished film. Never a good sign. And financially, it was catastrophic. The movie reportedly lost nearly its entire $55 million budget. Its legacy is basically sealed as one of the early 90s most expensive studio killer-level disasters. Now, we hit the universal double feature. Two baseball movies, same year, same studio, and they flop for very different reasons. First up is The Babe, Universal's Babe Ruth biopic. The studio put $25 million into it and cast John Goodman as the Sultan of SWAT, which honestly sounds perfect on paper. The film tracks Ruth from a Baltimore orphanage to becoming baseball's biggest icon, trying to cover the whole legend, his on-field dominance, the larger-than-life fame, and the messier side underneath, including his excess and personal demons. The problem is how safe it feels. Critics wrote it off as a standard sentimental sports flick, and once a biopic gets labeled by the numbers, the urgency disappears. Why rush to theaters for something that plays like a predictable checklist of greatest hits moments, especially when fans can get the basics from documentaries and highlight reels, without buzz or strong word of mouth? The movie just didn't stick. Financially, the math turned sour fast. On a $25 million budget, The Babe lost roughly $12 million. The takeaway is pretty brutal. Perfect casting can't save a story that never takes a real swing, and sometimes playing it safe is its own kind of risk. Then Universal tried the baseball angle again, but from the opposite direction with Mr. Baseball starring Tom Selleck. This one is built as a comedy with a clean, easy hook. Selleck plays a declining, egotistical major league star who gets traded to a Japanese team. So you're set up for classic fish-out-of-water beats, culture clash, friction with a strict manager, embarrassment, gradual humility, and the character learning to respect a different style of play to save his career. It's the kind of premise that sounds like it should travel too, because it's literally about an American player navigating Japanese baseball. But the movie stumbled anyway. It didn't resonate internationally the way you'd expect, and even in 1992, the humor and setup could feel a bit dated. Like a sports comedy formula audiences had already seen done better. Without a fresh angle or a breakout comedic identity, it couldn't separate itself from the pack. The financial sting was clear. On a $31 million budget, Mr. Baseball lost roughly $11 million, and the post-release reality was harsh. Rather than becoming a staple, it settled into that bargain bin tier of sports comedies people remember exists only when it shows up on a random cable rerun. Finally, we end with the movie Sylvester Stallone has famously called the worst of his career. Stop or my mom will shoot. On paper, it sounds like an easy crowd pleaser, action star plus fish-out-of-water comedy, but the reality is a cautionary tale. Stallone plays a tough police detective whose whole image is built on control and intimidation, until his overbearing mom shows up and starts meddling in his life and his cases. The comedy is basically her doing everything she shouldn't, cleaning his service weapon with bleach, tagging along on investigations, and somehow stumbling into situations that turn into real shootouts. The problem is tone. It's not satisfying as an action movie because the action keeps getting kneecapped by sitcom bits, and it's not satisfying as a comedy because the humor's so broad and awkward, it never really clicks. So it ends up pleasing nobody. Action fans didn't get the movie they came for, and comedy fans don't either. It didn't just underperform, it nosedived into obscurity, living on mostly as a punchline. Financially, it reportedly lost roughly $17 million on a $45 million budget. But its reputation is basically permanent, the kind of misfire people still bring up just to ask, how did this get made? Taken together, these 10 films make 1992 look like a year of pricey misreads. Historical epics dumped into full-on Columbus fatigue, high-concept swings that were just too weird for a mainstream crowd, and star vehicles that proved even the biggest names on the poster can't carry a movie if the script doesn't know what it is. The pattern isn't simply bad movies. It's studios backing projects they assumed were safe, only for audiences to shrug and move on. Drop a comment if you actually saw any of these in theaters, or tell me which one you remember discovering on late-night cable. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into Hollywood's biggest disasters, subscribe, because we've got plenty more box office bombs and dumping ground classics coming soon.